All right, Mr. Scheck, did you retrieve that item? Proceed.
So we're clear, Mr. Sims. Your position is that the positive control and the quality control, that the positive allelic control did not fail to give the correct result in this case, and therefore you did not have to redo this analysis.
Yes, there were some other ones in this case where I did redo them, but in this case, no. I felt that was the correct result, and I was confident of the interpretations that were made for all these strips.
And that's because you didn't think that the 1.3 dot was lighting up intensely enough to cause you to redo the hybridizations here.
That's correct.
And if the 1.3 dot was lighting up due to some kind of 1.3 contaminant, like a PCR carryover contaminant in your laboratory, that would be a problem with respect to interpreting item number 31 and the 1.3 dot in that strip.
Well, in other words, if there were contamination from product, I would expect that there'd be more likely you'd see it across in some of the other samples, the controls, too. I don't think that the contamination would necessarily pick out that one sample on 31, for example.
Well, if you see a 1.3 also on QC 816 as well as the positive control.
Well, again, I didn't say we saw a 1.3. There is a faint indication down there of 1.3. I believe we said it was scored as a hint of activity, but that's not to say that the 1.3 allele is there, because this 1.3 allele, as mentioned in the user guide, it's in the forensic literature, that sometimes you can get a faint response at the 1.3.
Now, to put it in terms that we discussed before, you're saying that the 1.3 in the positive control and in quality control sample 816 is an artifact.
Yes, I believe it is an artifact.
Or to put in another, more direct terms that we used before, it's not real.
It doesn't signify that the 1.3 allele is truly there.
But you are saying that the 1.3 in item 31, you feel confident is real.
Yes.
All right, now why don't we look at a strip that I'd ask to have marked as next in order. What would that be?
1168.
1168. And this is not a photograph of DQ alpha typings that you made on some of the Bundy drops.
This is, say it again, please.
It's a that is a photograph of hybridization strips for the Bundy drops, some of the Bundy drops.
Well, one of the Bundy drops is represented here, but then the other samples, I believe, are all Bundy drop controls.
Okay. And
substrate controls.
Sorry. And the Bundy drop in question there is what we've been calling item number 52.
Yes, it's our number 55A.
Right. And item number 52 is the Bundy drop that you were saying was degraded, but in your judgment, not substantially degraded.
That's my understanding, yes, because of the RFLP was obtained on that.
All right. And this is the Bundy drop that you would say has DNA in its best shape out of all the other Bundy drops in terms of degradation.
Well, as opposed to, for example, the rear gate?
No, I'm talking only about those samples collected on June 13th.
That's my understanding, yes. The 52 of the ones that I know of, that's the one.
Now I'd like to put this on the other.
All right.
And I'd like to go tight, if we could, to what's DNA 55A.
Mr. Scheck, you want to give Mr. Harris some direction here? I think we're missing part of it here.
Yes, Your Honor, but I think that in terms of the item of interest, we're focused in the area that we need to be.
Well, why don't we see the whole thing first?
Okay, first let's see the whole thing. Pull back. Okay, and if looking at DNA 55A, that's the strip that is the analysis of item 52, correct?
Well, this is one of the strips on which it was analyzed, yes.
This is the first analysis you made.
Yes.
All right. And this is the one that you typed as a 1.1, 1.2.
Yes, ultimately, the call on that sample was 1.1, 1.2.
And you did not call a 1.3 on this sample.
Well, again, let me refer to the actual notes page. That particular sample was scored as a C- trace, that particular dot.
Well, in other words, the score that you made was 1.1, 1.2.
Yes, at that time, that was the score that was made at that time.
And the 1.3 dot you did not score as real.
That's correct.
All right, now, Mr. Harris, could you go closer on that 1.3 dot? Now, you do, however, in your scoring indicate that you do see the 1.3 dot as a trace.
Yes, it's called a C- trace.
But you're saying that that 1.3 dot is not real. It's an artifact.
Well, I'm saying that in the context of this particular test was repeated because we were concerned with the interpretation of that particular result.
We'll get to the repetition in a second, but this call, even on the first run, before you repeated it, you scored it as a 1.1, 1.2, and you did not score the 1.3 as real.
Well, we didn't report anything at this point. There is no report was issued until we did the additional testing on this sample.
You have a scoring sheet.
Yes.
In your scoring sheet, you and the second reader scored it a 1.1, 1.2, and you said there was a trace of a 1.3, but you did not call the 1.3 as real.
Well,
at that point.
At that particular point, that's true.
And, okay, Your Honor, I'd ask that, because the visibility of these, Mr. Sims, could you put on the, on this Post-it, next to the lane that represents item 52, just an arrow and a 1.3. Maybe move the Post-it a little closer to the strip so it's clearer.
I have the same objection.
Noted. It's overruled.
Your Honor, may I pass this to the
May I
jury?
see it first?
Sure. Just one additional question for this.
Yes.
So we're clear, the 1.3 dot here on lane 52 You said in your first report here, and after your subsequent rehybbing of this, is not real, it's an artifact.
That's real. That's correct. In other words, I couldn't eliminate that it appeared just to be an artifact when I rehybbed it.
And, okay.
All right, well, if you hand it to juror number 7 this time. 7, top row. All right, Mr. Scheck, would you retrieve that item 1168 from Deputy Smith? All right, proceed.
And Mr. Sims, if that 1.3 dot on sample 52 was real as opposed to an artifact. Are you with me?
Okay.
Would that not be consistent with a mixture of degraded DNA from one contributor and additional DNA by way of a cross-contamination from a second contributor who had a 1.1, 1.2 genotype?
Objection. It's irrelevant cause for speculation. It's inconsistent with his testimony. This states his testimony.
Sustained.
Asking. Let us assume that the 1.3 allele on item 51 is real, okay?
On item 51 now,
Yes.
or 52?
I'm sorry, item 51, your one we've just looked at.
I think that's 52.
Did I say, I mean 50, LAPD item 52, the Bundy blood draw.
That sounds like the right one.
Right, okay?
Yes.
All right, and let us assume that that 1.3 dot that we just all looked at is real and not an artifact. Are you with me?
Okay.
Would not the typing on that strip we just examined be consistent with a mixture of a contributor with a 1.1, 1.2 genotype and a second contributor who contributed less DNA with a 1.3 genotype, 1.3, 1.3?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation. And this states his testimony. It's an improper hypothetical.
Overruled.
Would that, question is, would that be consistent? Is that one possibility?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, as we said, withdrawn, you agree that sample 52 has the DNA in it that is in the best shape of all the blood drops recovered on June 13th from the Bundy walkway.
That's my understanding, yes.
And if one were to assume that there was cross-contamination between Mr. Simpson's blood and the swatch 52 and others in the laboratory, are you with me? Assume some cross-contamination.
In other words, contamination from a reference sample?
From a reference sample or from other samples. Just assume cross-contamination. Let's not worry for the moment how it gets there.
Well, I would worry how it got there.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Let us assume that there is cross-contamination with sample 52 from a reference sample or from another swatch containing Mr. Simpson's blood that had a high DNA content.
Okay.
And let us further assume that the starting material on swatch number 52 had DNA that was degraded.
Okay.
Would not a result, assuming that 1.3 dot is a real dot, not an artifact? Are you with me?
Okay.
Would not the reading on this strip be consistent with that set of assumptions?
Objection. It's a mistake of testimony. It's an improper hypothetical, not based on fact. It calls for speculation. It's argumentative and compound.
Do you understand the factors involved in the question?
I think I understand the first about half of it, and then I kind of lost it on the second half.
Sustained.
Which factor don't you understand?
Well, when you start to talk about where the 1.3 comes in.
All right. I'm asking you to assume the 1.3 we saw in that strip is real.
Okay.
All right. And assuming the other conditions that we talked about with respect to cross-contamination.
Okay.
Would that strip not be consistent? Wouldn't that strip be consistent with the hypothetical I just gave you?
Yeah, I have an objection. It's the same grounds. May we approach on this?
No.
Did I cite a case earlier?
No.
for the proposition?
No. Sit down. Sustained.
If one assumes that 1.3 dot is a real allele,
Okay.
is that not consistent with a mixture of starting material that is degraded that contains a 1.3 allele and
Yeah, I must object. I'm sorry to interrupt. The same grounds. It assumes facts, not evidence. It misstates his own testimony.
Overruled.
Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
let's start again. If that 1.3 dot is real, is it not consistent, is the strip we just looked at, isn't it consistent with a mixture where the source of the 1.3 has less DNA in it than the source of the 1.1, 1.2?
Yes, that's one possibility.
All right. Now, you redid item number 52. That's what you called a re-hybridization.
Yes, I rehybed that sample.
And you rehybed that sample because you were troubled by the intensity of the 1.3 dot, and you wanted to see if you could resolve whether it was real or not real.
Well, that was part of it. The second reason was that I think in that particular run, the positive control showed a little bit of the 1.3, and so did the quality control sample that was run on that particular set. And those two samples were what we called it, or actually this is the initial reader called the trace or hint trace level. And so that was another clue that maybe there was a hybridization question on those particular results. So
Well-
the totality is all of that together. Yes, that's why that was repeated.
Well, you just said that you ran it again because you saw a hint of the 1.3 dot on the quality control sample and the positive control.
Well, this is getting very technical, but the level of that 1.3 was somewhat increased relative to the C dots on the positive control and on the quality control sample in this particular run, as opposed to, I think it was on the prior run that you mentioned, where we had, what was it, 31 and 3.0, I think it was 3.0.
You make out scoring sheets where two readers look at these dots, right?
Yes.
And on the scoring sheet for this strip that contains item 52, when you looked at the positive control and the quality assurance control, the 1.3 was characterized as a faint trace or a hint.
One was the quality control sample was characterized as a trace, and the positive control was characterized as a hint/trace.
And on the previous run with the console, the quality control strip and the positive control were also characterized as hints of the 1.3.
Only as hints, yes, but the reader felt that these two results on this second run were slightly higher on the 1.3. And I realize this is a subtle difference, but this is what an examiner looks at.
Well, you called them both hints, right?
On the first run, they were called hints. On the second run, one was called a hint/trace, the other was called a trace. And a trace is more than a hint in our vernacular.
And when you're making these distinctions between hints and traces, you're talking about almost imperceptible levels of intensity differences.
Well, they're the kinds of differences that would be best left to the judgment of the expert, someone who has expertise and experience in dealing with these types of interpretations, yes.
Well, you're literally looking, just as the jury did with your naked eye, at those little intensities of the dots. That's what you're doing.
Yes, except I have a trained eye. That would be the only distinction I would make.
And other trained eyes, looking at these particular calls that you made, you might expect could have a different interpretation of these small intensities, other experienced analysts like yourself.
You mean such as Dr. Blake?
Dr. Blake, Dr. Gerdes, Dr. Mullis, others.
I don't know if Dr. Blake, for example, would disagree with these interpretations.
What about Dr. Mullis or Dr. Gerdes?
Abstain.
The you reran this, to get back to this item 52, you did what you called a re-hybridization.
Yes.
And that is, you took some of the amplified product left over and you ran it on the strip again.
That's correct.
And did you develop it for the same amount of time on the strip that you did the first one?
I'd have to check the notes on that point. I'm looking at a Xeroxed copy of the initial run, and I'm having trouble seeing exactly how long the development was. According to our protocol, it's 20 to 30 minutes is the standard development time.
Well, let's just see if we can make clear before the break what we mean by development time. You're saying that sometimes when you put the amplified product on the strip, you're literally waiting for almost like a photograph for the dots to develop. Is that right?
Well, yes, at the very last part after you've added the color reagents, then there's a certain time that passes as these dot intensities develop.
And the longer you let it develop, the more you'll see luminosity from the dots.
Yes, you'll see an increase in the color to a certain point.
And the less long you leave it to develop, the less you'll see luminosity from the dots.
Well, it gets to a certain point. That's what happens, is that you can overdevelop these strips. That can happen. And it's mentioned in the user guide, for example, that you can overdevelop these strips. And for example, Dr. Blake commented several times that we overdeveloped our strips, and that might be one reason we see more of this 1.3 week result.
Was that the hypothesis you were pursuing when you were re-hybridizing this?
That's one of the things that I've always thought, that we do let our strips develop a long time, yes.
And so the second time that you hybridized item number 52, you didn't let it develop as long.
No, I didn't say that at all. I let that go 22 minutes, it looks like, according to my results, and 20 to 30 minutes is what's called for in the protocol.
Well, did you let the first strip where you saw a darker 1.3 go for longer?
As I mentioned, I couldn't say that for sure because I'm looking at a Xerox copy of the notes, and that may be at the very bottom, and I'm not picking it up.
But when you re-hybridized, when you did it again, you still saw a faint trace of the 1.3 dot in your second hybridization, didn't you?
I think on that particular run sheet, well, let me look at it right here. I have it.
That was the one performed on December 31st, 1994.
Yes, I think in the run sheet I did score that as a very faint trace. Well, I scored it as a faint trace. I think the photograph of that one speaks for itself.
Well, when you're analyzing these dot plots and you look at it in the tray as it's developing, often the analyst will be able to see intensities that are not picked up on the photograph.
Well, we usually read the strips and then photograph them. So they're, depending on the quality of the photograph, that could be true. There are subtle things that one may not see on a photograph.
All right,
So,
Mr.
last
Scheck,
question, Your Honor, one last question. So the fact of the matter is, when you looked at the strip, when you re-hybridized it, you, Mr. Sims, recorded that there was still a faint trace of the 1.3 dot.
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our break for the lunch recess. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock.
In the morning session are beyond what the case law in this state allows. Under the authority of Hyatt versus Sierra Boat Company, 79 Cal F 3rd 325, the clear law in this state is an expert opinion must not be based on speculative or conjectural data. It is well settled that an expert's assumption of facts contrary to the proof destroys the opinion. And the reason I think that's important is those are fairly moderate statements of the law. This court overruled my objections where Mr. Sims was forced to assume something that was contrary to his own opinion, which really turns the whole concept stands on its head, and must feel very bizarre for him to assume something that he knows is in fact scientifically incorrect. And we have these faceless, reasonable scientists that might disagree. So I think it's about time that we draw the line on the hypotheticals, at least until the defense calls some of these people that might disagree, and then we can address their credibility or the basis for their opinions. But I'd really like the court to consider the legal authority and draw the line on some of these hypotheticals when they're not even arguably based on facts that were presented. That last one forced him to assume something that was contrary to his own opinion, and we've been given no discovery that there's any other opinion by any defense expert in this case. I'd love to see Dr. Blake's report. I know it's quite a lengthy document, but right now this expert has been forced to pretend that he feels something might be other than what he knows it is, and we've never been given any reciprocal discovery from the people that Mr. Scheck mentioned that they even have an opinion to the contrary. So I'd like to revisit that with and perhaps have the court reconsider the ruling and striking that testimony, because it just stands the whole premise or the whole principle of allowing reasonable hypotheticals based on the evidence in the case and totally ignores it and just lets people pretend whatever they want.
Your Honor, I think that this witness, for example, just in the one instance that Mr. Harmon raised, indicated that he thought this was a quote-unquote tough call. And it seems to me a fair inference from the evidence when you're dealing with small dot intensity differences, and just to illustrate a basic principle of how he even arrived at his conclusions and what the issues are, to ask him to assume that this is real instead of an artifact when he goes through a whole chain of inferences to come to his opinion that it's an artifact as opposed to real. And it seems to me that's well within the scope of a reasonable hypothetical. And it seems to me that what the prosecution likes to do is say, well, if our witness said that something is X and is true in our opinion, then it's absolutely impermissible to ask a hypothetical opinion to assume X isn't true. And it seems to me that that's not the law, and that's not even, particularly when the hypotheticals are based upon fair inferences in the evidence and are designed to set up the contrast between what this witness says and what other witnesses could say about those facts. And I think he even agreed that reasonable experts could make different calls based on these dot intensities. He said that himself. It's not what his view is, but he agreed others might. So I think that that particular hypothetical was certainly within the range of what one could draw from fair inferences on the evidence. And in this particular area, I think it's also important to be able to put questions to the witness to illustrate the principles that are at issue here, so we can understand what their opinions are and what they aren't.
Just very briefly, the problem is when it's a hypothetical, the hypothetical is governed by the law in the state, and it must be based on facts, not the evidence. If you want to ask him principles, you change the form of the question. But to force a man to say, I'll assume that even though I don't believe it's true, as I say, he must feel like he had an out-of-body experience when that happened because he knows it's not true. And here the legal system is making him pretend that it is to satisfy Mr. Scheck's curiosity when there's a different form of the question. It is well settled that it must not be based on speculative or conjectural data. He's not conjecturing. That's not the data that he relied on. I think the other point is this tough call business, that is not what the tough call was about. And you'll be pleased to hear what the tough call was about on redirect examination, but it doesn't relate to this issue at all. So I just like to resume getting in line with California authority and the evidence code and having hypotheticals based on some reasonable interpretation of the evidence and not forcing people to pretend that things are other than what they know and that there is no conflicting data. If they want to make an offer of proof, it appears that we seem to have disgorged some data from Dr. Gerdes. And it's clear that this court has engaged in in-camera review of defense discovery, and it's slowly starting to trickle out now. If they want to make an offer of proof that there is some evidence to the contrary, then number one, we've been sandbagged since January on that material, and number two, we'd like to have a chance to review it, and we need to call a halt to the proceedings. So, but without an offer of proof, the only evidence or the only offer of proof is that that was not a 1-3, Your Honor.
Court's previous ruling stands. Let's have the jury, please. Let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Gary Sims is again on the witness stand undergoing concluding cross-examination by Mr. Scheck. Deputy McNair, would you make arrangements to stay late tonight, please, with the whole staff? Thank you. Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We will finish Mr. Sims today.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Afternoon, Mr. Sims.
Good afternoon.
Now, Mr. Sims, just one last point on with respect to LAPD item number 52. You were talking about two different kinds of tests performed on that item, the DQ alpha test, that the strip we just reviewed, you recall that?
Yes.
And an RFLP test that was conducted by Cellmark.
Yes.
Now, the DQ, out of those two techniques, the DQ alpha system is what is known as the more sensitive one.
Yes.
And that means that if there were some small degraded contribution to item 52, one would be more likely to see that with the DQ alpha system than you would with the RFLP system.
Yes.
Now, referring you to your findings with respect to the Bronco,
Okay.
Your findings are that looking at the data now for the stains recovered on both June 14th and September 1st, that the primary DNA source on those bloodstains in the console was someone with DNA types consistent with Mr. Simpson's.
Actually, not as vague as the rich stains.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
All right, let's start with the call. We had some lengthy discussion about the call you made on item 31.
Yes.
And, but assuming your call is correct with respect to item 31, it's your interpretation that the primary contributor would be someone with the 1.1, 1.2 allele, the genotype,
Now, this is with regards to
31.
31. Yes, this was, when I'd mentioned about this was the one with the tough call, that was the tough part of the call, was to decide whether or not we could say that there was a 1.1, 1.2 there as a major type. And I would contrast that with the one that we called DNA 30, which you had on the chart, where we said possible 1.2, where you showed the listing of the results.
But my question, sir, is simply, on 31, your finding was that the primary contributor, the primary contribution was DNA with the 1.1, 1.2 genotype.
That's correct. That was the interpretation that we made from that result.
And on 303, which was collected on September 1st, your interpretation that the primary contributor of the genotype in the DQ alpha system was the 1.1, 1.2 genotype.
This is now on 303.
Yes.
No, on 303, we just listed the alleles. I don't think we didn't state about which one tended to be the primary on 303.
So in 303, in your judgment, there is, you can't distinguish where there's a primary contributor and where there's a secondary contributor or contributors.
That's correct. In other words, the dot intensities were fairly well balanced for those different, like the 1.3 and the 1.1.
And as to 304, would you say that the primary contributor, based on your reading of dot intensities, would be DNA from the 1.1, 1.2?
No, it was more like 303. Again, the similarity of the alleles was noted so that it wasn't clear necessarily what went with what from that strip.
So you can't, you would make no interpretation as to which was the primary and which was the secondary contribution?
Based on the DQ alpha, we did not.
In combination with the D1S80, did you make interpretations?
Well, we noted, for example, that the 18 allele was weaker on the D1S80.
Excuse me 1 second. Now, your tests do not indicate when or in what order sources of DNA got on the console.
That's correct. In other words, I don't know the exact sequence of how things got on the console. That's correct.
And the console is a comparatively large area within the Bronco that people could touch.
Yes.
And in your experience as a forensic scientist, it's the kind of substrate that could contain traces of saliva or other biological material.
Yes, it could.
And this data that you've been reporting to us could be consistent with blood from Mr. Simpson being smeared on that console first, and then some other person or persons subsequently entering the car and contributing biological material to the stains on the console.
Well, it would have to be a significant contribution, and it would have to be a very consistent contribution across the console.
Of traces of other alleles.
Yes.
Now, are you saying that with respect to sample 303, you cannot make any determination as to which alleles are associated with a primary contributor and which ones are associated with secondary contributors?
Well, the principal interpretation there, I think, would again be the 18 allele, that appeared to go as a secondary contribution.
I'm only talking about the DQ alpha system.
No, on the DQ alpha, we did not break that down.
All right. So as far as you're concerned in the DQ alpha system, you cannot make any assessment in terms of the strengths of the dots to differentiate the 1.1 from the 1.2 from the 1.3 from the 1.4.
Well, again, there may be some subtleties there, but we did not make any distinction along those lines, no.
All right. So looking at the stain in 303 and the DQ alpha system, you've identified a series of alleles within the mixture, correct?
Yes.
That's the 1.1, the 1.2, the 1.3, and the 1.4.
Well, wait, not the 1.4. I think you mean the 4.
The 4, I'm sorry.
And also on the 1.2, we noted that it's a possible 1.2.
Okay.
That would be correct.
All right. Now, in assessing the possible withdrawn. An analyst such as yourself will review possible genotype combinations that could be within a mixture such as stain 303
Yes.
on the DQ alpha system.
Yes.
And Mr. Simpson's genotype for this DQ alpha system is a 1.1, 1.2.
Yes, it is.
Now, if one assumes that Mr. Simpson's genotype of 1.1, 1.2 is within that stain, 303, one can, by a simple series of figuring out combinations, come up with other two-person genotype combinations which, when combined with Mr. Simpson's 1.1, 1.2 genotype, will account for all the DQ alpha alleles in stain 303.
Well, yes, those other types that could account for those, yes, all the alleles.
Now, I'd like to have this marked as defendant's next in order. Two-page document.
1169.
Ask you to look at this and see if you would agree that the list here of genotypes represents the actual combination of two-person genotypes, withdrawn, represents two-person genotype combinations which, when combined with Mr. Simpson's genotype of 1.1, 1.2, will account for all the DQ alpha alleles in stain 303.
Okay. Yes, this is the list you showed me at the break, and I believe those are correct.
Your Honor, could I? Now, let me just put that up on the Elmo to give an idea of what this looks like. So this chart, as one moves down it, just simply lists all the different possible genotypes of a second contributor and a third contributor that could account for all the DQ alpha alleles in stain 303 when combined with Mr. Simpson's genotype. And I've let the record reflect I now push the page down through page 1, which gives 23 combinations, and now I'm exhibiting 24 through 37. Now, so I was looking at this chart. Out of these combinations on the chart of two people's genotypes that could account for all of the DQ alpha alleles in stain 303 when in combination with Mr. Simpson's genotype, isn't it true that only two include the genotypes of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson in combination?
I'm going to have to look at this for a minute because I noticed that you have the second and third, and then you just change the types for you just reverse the order. For example, in number 1, you have 1.1, comma 1.1 for the second contributor. Then you have a third contributor as a 1.3, comma 4. But then you also on 24 list the second contributor as being 1.3, comma 4, and the third contributor as being 1.1, comma 1.1.
Well, Mr. Sims, just take your time, study the chart, and see if you can tell us, out of all the combinations on that chart, of two people's genotypes that would account for all the alleles in the DQ alpha system in the mixture stain of 303, how many of those combinations, and see if you're clear with me on the question, would include the genotype of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson as the second and third contributor? Out of those combinations, how many are included in that combination? That is, Nicole Brown Simpson's DQ alpha type and Ronald Goldman's DQ alpha type together. Do you understand my question?
I think so.
Okay.
May I write on the...
Do you have a clean copy of that available?
Page 1, so. Let's go page 1.
No, he's already started on that one. Mr. Simpson, you've already started on that one. I just
Yes.
want to make sure you have a clean copy available.
Now, the question has to be that they are both together, as opposed to the possibility that one could be there with somebody else.
Right, we're just asking
Both
on
together.
the hypothetical that Mr. Simpson's genotype 1.1, 1.2 is there, and if, looking at the number of combinations that one could have of two other contributors that explain all the alleles, in terms of those combinations, tell us how many of those combinations are ones where Nicole Brown-Simpson's genotypes and Ronald Goldman's genotypes together part of the combination.
Okay. Okay, I see it in two of them,
Two of them.
yes.
So out of the 37 combinations there, only two are consistent with of a two-person genotype combinations, which, when combined with O.J. Simpson's genotype of 1.1, 1.2, will account for all the DQ alpha alleles in stain 303. Only two of them are ones where that have Nicole Brown-Simpson's genotype and Ronald Goldman's genotype together.
Yes, from this list, that's correct.
Now, let's discuss the steering wheel, item number 29.
Okay?
On direct examination, Mr. Harmon asked you to read from your report with respect to your findings on the steering wheel. Do you recall that?
Yes.
But subsequent to your report, there was additional testing by Cellmark.
Yes.
And that testing was the same DQ alpha locus that you looked at,
Yes.
and also a polymarker test.
Yes.
Would you not agree, Mr. Sims, that looking at your data and the Cellmark data, that the best interpretation of item number 29 is that the person who deposited the 4 allele is either a genotype of 1.14, 44, or 1.24? That's the best interpretation of the data.
I know that expression, best interpretation of the data, because that's the term that Dr. Blake uses when he interprets data like that. And I think that probably is, for our purposes, the best interpretation of that data, yes. I think I brought this out, and I won't go into detail again, but I don't think we can be absolutely sure that that is the correct interpretation.
But as far as you're concerned, looking at all the data, that is certainly the best interpretation.
Well, again, that's without studying the Cellmark data. That's just looking at what I see on our DQ alpha results, and I'd have to sit down with the Cellmark data and perhaps talk to Dr. Cotton about all those results and look at intensities and all that sort of thing, and I haven't done that.
Well, you have looked at their polymarker. Could I mark this defendant's next in order?
Defendant's 1170.
You have looked at their polymarker strip.
I looked at this briefly, yes.
And looking at the intensities of dots on the polymarker strip, those would tend to support the interpretation, the best interpretation of the data that you and I just agreed upon.
Well, I don't feel comfortable giving an opinion on that because I don't have a lot of hands-on experience with polymarker, and I'd have to rely on talking to somebody like Dr. Cotton about her interpretation. So I don't think I should give that particular opinion.
Well, in terms of the intensities of the dots, for example, at the without going into excruciating detail, but looking at the dots at the HBGG locus,
Objections beyond this witness's expressed expertise.
Beyond the scope, direct as well, sustained.
well, Dr. Cotton's interpretation of number 29 is that it is a DQ alpha type 1.1, 1.2, and 4 in the mixture.
Yes.
And you do not disagree with that finding, do you?
No, I don't.
And I think, as you just indicated, you would agree that the best interpretation of the data is that the contributor of the 4 allele in this mixture would either have a 1.14, a 4.4, or a 1.24 genotype.
Actually, it's vague as to what that data is.
Sustained, rephrase the question.
The data that you have, and from what you've seen of the DQ alpha data from Cellmark, and looking at all the data, would you not agree that the best interpretation is that the person who deposited the 4 allele is either a 1.14, a 4.4, or a 1.24?
Well, again, I don't use that interpretation, that best interpretation line. I would normally say that, yes, I think that's probably what's going on here, but I would hold open that possibility that I mentioned.
Now, well, wouldn't you say that based on the fact that the 4 dot is greater than the all control in your tests, that it is extremely unlikely that the 4 is from an individual who possesses the 1.3 allele?
I'd have to look at that strip again to make that comment.
And Mr. Sims, what's the exhibit number on that?
1166. I think this is the wrong photo.
Okay. Do you have the photo there? Do you have your Photo
Yes,
of
I can.
steering
I
wheel?
think I can produce that.
Why don't we use the one that's in evidence, counsel?
No, I don't think we have it. If it's not on this strip, then
All right.
I'm not sure it is in evidence. While Mr. Sims is looking for that, Your Honor, I ask permission to pull out the chart so that I can go through what I think is the last line.
My answer to your question is I don't think the all but 1.3 dot is particularly relevant here because I think, as you mentioned when we were discussing about how these dot calls are made, if the other samples have activity that will light up a dot, then I don't think that interpretation is proper here. I don't think the all but 1.3 call, the call on that dot, is particularly relevant to the discussion at the levels of intensity that we're talking about.
Now, assuming that there is a contributor to the item number 29, the steering wheel stain, that's a 1.14, a 4.4, or a 1.24. Are you with me?
Okay.
Such an individual could also be a contributor based on the data you find on the stains on the console, 303, 304, and 305.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but the problem is the easel, Mr. Harris, is blocking juror number 7's view of the witness here.
Maybe if we could move the big one away, I think that would be better. If we can move the big one and then away for a minute, that'll make it easier. Do you have my last question in mind?
If you could repeat it, please.
Sure. An individual with the individuals withdrawn. The genotypes 1.14, 4.4, or 1.24 all could be genotypes that contributed to the stains on the console 303, 304, 305, and your interpretation of 31.
Okay, I'm with you on 303 and 304. Now, the other one you mentioned was?
305.
And the other one, the last one was?
Your interpretation of 31, the June 14th sample.
In other words, would we be able to exclude somebody with those genotypes out of these mixes? Is
That's
that
right.
the basic question? And the mixtures that we're talking about are 1.1, 4, 1.2, 4, and 4.4?
1.14 is one potential genotype, 4.4 is another potential genotype, and 1.24 is another potential genotype.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, do you have, I'm sorry. Looking at, if we go with the view that there was a contributor to the stain on the steering wheel, number 29, that, may I just write on this board, this chart? One of the genotypes we mentioned was a 1.14, correct?
Yes.
Another genotype we mentioned was a 1.24.
Yes.
And the third genotype we mentioned was a 4.4.
Yes.
All right. Now, do you have with you the frequency tables that you use to calculate the frequencies for the genotypes you reported for the prosecution for the DQ alpha system?
Yes, I believe I do have that table.
Now, starting with the Caucasians,
Okay.
what is the frequency of the 1.14 genotype in the Caucasian population
I'll give this as a percent.
as a percentage?
7.6%.
What is the frequency of the genotype 1.24 for the Caucasian population?
12%.
What is the frequency of the 4.4 genotype?
Caucasian again would be
Yes.
8%.
What is the frequency of the 1.14 genotype for the African American population?
8.9%.
What is the frequency for the 1.24 allele for the African American population?
This would be for the 1.2, 4 genotype, not
That's
allele.
right. Sorry.
Okay, 18.
What is the frequency of the 4, 4 genotype for the African American population?
9.5%.
For the Hispanic population, the 1.14.
9%.
Excuse me, for the 1.24.
The 1.24,
Yes.
9.2%.
And for the 4.4.
17%.
Now, if one were to add together the frequencies of these three genotypes for the Caucasian population, the 1.14, the 1.24, and the 4.4, what would be the sum?
May I just look at the chart?
Please. In fact, to save us time, why don't you add it up for all three columns? Or maybe I should move this exhibit around.
In the
so-
center, all right.
Now, in the chart labeled People's 260, there's a column indicating individuals not excluded, correct?
Yes.
And that's not excluded in terms of the genotype combinations that could be found in the stains, some of which are mixtures.
Yes.
And with respect now to the steering wheel, what we've done in this chart is list the frequencies for the Caucasian population, the African American population, and the Hispanic population for the genotype 1.14.
Yes.
And these reflect percentages of those populations that can't be excluded, just as the 1.14 genotype can't be excluded as contributors to stain 29 on the steering wheel.
You lost me a little bit at the very end there. In other words, you asked me about those 3 possible genotypes, and what I'm giving you is the listing of those frequencies in the various population groups.
Right. And for Caucasians, withdrawn. And we had, with respect to the steering wheel, we agreed that it's consistent with the findings that the contributor of the 4 allele could have a 1.14, a 1.24, and a 4.4, correct?
That's correct. In other words, if we threw out the possibility that that 4 could go with any other type and just said that this has to be a 4 standing by itself with those other 2 alleles, you know, continuing the hypothetical, yes.
So in other words, the possible contributor of the 4 allele could have one of these 3 genotypes.
Well, again, I couldn't absolutely rule out that that 4 allele went with a weak allele or an allele from the weaker component that didn't get amplified at that level of sensitivity.
You're saying that that's a phenomenon known as allelic dropout, isn't it?
No.
Well, withdrawn. You agree, you don't disagree with Selmark's position that Mr. Goldman's 1.34 is excluded.
Well, I think we went through this the other day about how this kind of call or how this interpretation can be made. And my concern was that we are amplifying so little DNA to begin with on this sample. We're talking about 400 of these picograms that we mentioned, and we're talking about that 4 allele perhaps going with a as part of the weaker component of that 400. So you really are getting down there, and you're really pushing the system to say that you could guarantee that you'd see everything from the weaker contribution. That's my concern, and I think we went through all this a couple days ago.
Yeah, but your concern would apply then to possible other, if that's your concern, then you can't rule out the possibility of other contributions at low levels on 303, 304, 305.
Well, again, I can only talk about what I can see, and what I can see are a certain number of alleles and a certain number of types, and I can see certain patterns emerging as I look at across the results in this case. But on any particular sample, for example, there could be one cell from you, and I might not detect it.
Okay. But let's just look at what you did see on sample 29 from the Bronco.
On sample 29 now from the Bronco.
Yes, the steering wheel.
This is the steering wheel, right.
And all you saw was a 1.1, a 1.2, and a 4.
That's correct.
You didn't see a 1.3.
No.
And you agree that the best interpretation of the data is that the genotype of the contributor of the 4 is either a 1.14, a 1.24, or a 4.4.
True.
Well, if he wouldn't stop, is that true?
Well,
Withdrawn, withdrawn. Let's just go through this. If one looks at the 1.14, the 1.24, and the 4.4
okay.
for the Caucasian population, okay,
Okay.
and adds together the frequencies for those genotypes,
Yes.
that 27.6% represents the percentage of the population that cannot be excluded as the source of the 4 allele on the steering wheel.
With all those assumptions in place, yes.
All right? And with respect to the African American population, 36.4% of the population cannot be excluded as the possible source of the 4 allele on the steering wheel.
Again, with those assumptions, yes.
And looking at the Hispanic population, 35.2% of the Hispanic population cannot be excluded as the source of the 4 allele on the steering wheel.
That's correct, same assumptions.
And I recall on direct examination that Mr. Harmon asked you some questions about the percentage of the population that couldn't be excluded as possible sources of the 4 allele on the steering wheel.
Stay.
Did Mr. Harmon ask you some questions about excluding the front line of the San Antonio Spurs and the Los Angeles Lakers? You recall that?
Get into that again.
I don't want to get into those.
We're not.
So you sit here, can you exclude the front line
No,
or the starting 5 of the robbery homicide squad of the Los Angeles Police Department as possible contributors of the 4 allele?
I don't think so. Try again.
All right. Can you exclude these are, let's put it this way, 27.6% of the Caucasian population is over a fourth.
Yes, it is over a fourth.
36.4% of the African American population is over a third.
Yes, it is over a third.
The same thing is true with the Hispanic population.
Yes.
And to the extent that those populations are in combination among personnel in the robbery homicide squad of the Los Angeles Police Department, these percentages would apply to them as they would anybody else.
Stay.
1 second, Your Honor. And Mr. Sims, if we follow through on a caveat that you gave us, would that be a fair, no, that may be a bad word. You gave a qualification of some kind with respect to your reading on the steering wheel, correct?
Yes.
And you're saying it's possible that there might be some unknown allele that goes with the 4.
I'm saying that's a possibility that I would consider.
And if one follows through on the possibility of there being an unknown allele that goes with the 4 and factors that in, then that would include 100% of the Caucasian and African American and Hispanic population if you factored in an unknown allele here.
Well, it is much more complex than that because you do get into questions of how these allele sequences are related to each other and which ones you may see this phenomenon going into. So I'm not going to give a blanket statement to that. It's a very complex part of the technology.
Well, if you assume that there is a possible unknown allele that could be a contribution to the mixture in the steering wheel, and just follow that hypothesis through, the percentage of the population not excluded would be even larger than the ones that are on this chart.
Well, in this particular case where I have a 1.1, 1.2 demonstrated as a main type, then the main allele I would be worried about with this phenomenon is the 1.3 allele. Not the 2 allele so much, not the 3 allele. It really does come down to the 1.3 allele. And that's just a complex part of this technology. It's not a blanket statement that I would just throw out there for all of these alleles.
I'm asking you about just the question. I understand that's your explanation. Just the question. If you assume that there is a possible unknown allele, following through with your hypothesis that's not being detected, then it would be consistent in terms of calculating the percentages that they would get even larger than those that are put on the board as to the possible genotypes that can't be excluded.
Well, again, I think this begs the question of what if there, for example, was a cell from you on that steering wheel? I might not detect it.
Mr. Sims, could you answer my question?
Well, I don't understand.
Wait. Don't argue with the witness.
Sorry.
Don't argue with the lawyer.
Mr. Sims, my question to you, sir. If you assume that there could be a contribution on the steering wheel of an allele that you can't see, are you with me?
Yes.
If you were to calculate the percentage of the population that couldn't be excluded as contributors to the steering wheel, it would be even larger than the percentages for each racial group than is depicted on this chart.
Yes, it would be larger.
Thank you. No further questions.
1171. All right, Mr. Harmon, you ready to go forward, or you want 5 minutes? 10 minutes? All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to switch to redirect by Mr. Harmon. I'll give him 10 minutes to set up. And I'll just ask you to step back in the jury room, and we'll call you out as soon as we're ready to go. All right, Mr. Sims, you can stretch your legs. Back quiet, please. All right, let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Sims, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, good afternoon again, Mr. Sims. Mr. Harmon.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Sims, I want to start out addressing some of the issues that Mr. Scheck raised in cross-examination with you. Is that okay?
Okay.
I noticed that in response to many of Mr. Scheck's hypotheticals, you gave answers that things were possible. Do you recall
Yes.
that? Did any answer that you gave expressing a possibility to Mr. Scheck's hypotheticals, did any of those answers in any way undermine any of the results and opinion you've previously addressed on direct examination?
Speculative, argumentative.
Overruled.
Now,
And why did you say it's possible so many times?
well, when hypotheticals are created, certainly you get to a point where you can say anything is possible, and anything is possible.
Now, Mr. Sims, do you remember Mr. Scheck asked you whether or not you had any reason to believe Robin Cotton was involved in a conspiracy?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe Greg Matheson's involved in any conspiracy to frame the defendant in this case, Mr. Simpson?
No.
Do you have any reason to believe that Dennis Fung is involved in a conspiracy to...
No foundation outside the scope.
Sustained.
Mr. Sims, Mr. Scheck asked you to, in another one of these hypotheticals, to describe the numbers of possible combinations that could be accounted for in the stain on the console, item 303. And he asked you to assume that the defendant's type, a 1112, is in there. And he gave you that sheet. Do you recall that sheet?
Yes.
And you looked very carefully at that sheet, did you not?
Yes.
And it's true, is it not, that that's only one of the markers that you performed on that stain on 303?
Yes, DQ alpha was only one of the markers we tested for.
So that sheet and that entire series of questions ignored an entire set of data that you produced from your analyses on those stains, did it not?
Yes, it did.
But let's take it at face value, if you will, okay, Mr. Sims?
Okay.
You described, ignoring half of the data that your lab produced, that
Rephrase the question.
you described in not addressing the D1S80 data that you produced in your test of that stain, that only 2 of the 37 combinations were consistent with combinations of the victims? Is that the way you described it?
The way the hypothetical was presented, yes.
Okay. And let's talk about possible interpretations of those 37 results, only 2 of which were consistent with the victims in this case, okay?
Okay.
Could that mean that there were 35 other people killed that night whose blood was in that car?
Objection.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Could that mean that there were 35 other dead people whose blood was found on that console in that car?
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Could that mean that there were 35 other deceased people whose blood was found in the stain in 303?
Sustained.
Would that mean that there were 35 other living people whose blood was found on that stain in
35
the
other
car?
persons who may have contributed with different genotypes.
Yes.
Okay. For example, you can't exclude the possibility that 35 other people with different genotypes had nosebleeds on that same spot on the console, can you?
Well, again, they'd have to miss the substrate control area, but that's true.
Okay. Is there something funny about Broncos that might cause nosebleeds like that?
Sustained.
Mr. Scheck asked you, and you struggled to try to think of a casework experience you've had.
Sustained. Why don't you rephrase it without the
Sure.
characterization?
Remember, Mr. Scheck asked you whether or not you'd had an actual case where you had blood mixtures.
Overall proficiency, in the context of proficiency testing.
Well, and then he went on, and I believe you said you thought you'd encountered such a thing in casework. Do you recall that?
Let's have him-
Objection, it only asked him about proficiency tests. and that was his
Sustained.
answer.
Have you ever encountered a blood mixture in actual casework?
Yes, I have.
Could you explain the scenario or the setting of that case?
Yes, the
Objection, not the scope.
Overruled.
scenario, as I recall it, was an individual was beaten with a weapon, it was a blunt object that caused a lot of bleeding of the victim. And the issue was whether or not we could find some of the perpetrator's type who also we thought might be bleeding on that particular weapon, perhaps at the handle end. And we were able to show that there was a mixture of victim and perpetrator blood, and it did happen that the blood then did match also the perpetrator's type, or the suspect's type. So
So-
those things are happening, yes.
So in the context of that case, it was the mixture of these two coincidental types that was significant to you, is that right?
Yes,
And it is a challenge trying to sort those things out, is it not, when they're blood mixtures?
yes, it is, and that's why I think it's important to look at all the data,
All the different markers that you test.
all the different markers and all the results.
And in the context of that case, you found the victim's blood on something associated with the suspect,
Yes, that was it.
and then the suspect's own blood mixture on something associated with him.
Yes, that was it, basically.
Okay. Just to digress for a second, if you saw Mr. Simpson's type in a stain and you were unable to see a C dot there, how would you report that?
In our laboratory, we would not consider that to be a typable result. We would note the types, but we would not consider it to be a reportable result.
Okay. Now, Mr. Scheck asked you whether or not your tests can show the order of deposition, or when or the order of deposition on the console. Do you recall that?
Yes,
In fact, regardless of when or how or the sequence of events that cause stains to be deposited there, if your tests show the types that are actually there, they've performed successfully. Is that true?
Characterization.
Overruled.
I would say yes.
For example, the steering wheel. Can you tell when or the order those stains or those actual biological materials were deposited there?
No.
And Mr. Scheck's, the handwritten chart with those large numbers on it, do those numbers also ignore some of the data that was produced in this on that stain?
Rephrase the question. Rephrase the question.
Is there other data that was produced as a result of yours and Cellmark's testing on the steering wheel that could tend to contribute to the frequencies that you calculated?
Well, yes, there was data generated by Cellmark with regards to the polymarker.
Is your opinion as it was when you testified last week concerning being unable to say that the 1.3 allele is not there?
Can you rephrase that again?
Sure. Is your concern or your opinion about the results of 29, the steering wheel stain, is it, as you expressed it last week, that you cannot say that because of the low amount of DNA that was in that sample, that the 1.3 allele is not there?
That's correct. In other words, I cannot unequivocally say that we would have seen the 1.3 allele in that test.
And in that regard, in that context, including all the data that was produced in this case, what is the significance of Mr. Scheck's handwritten chart summing up frequencies?
Sustain. Rephrase the question. Significance.
What is the forensic significance of the summed up chart?
No, it's not a motion to strike. It's an objection. Rephrase the question.
In your opinion, does Mr. Scheck's chart, in light of the concern that you, or the limitation or the reservation you have about 29, what does the chart mean when it sums up all the frequencies?
Objection.
Sustain. Rephrase the question. The question's unintelligible.
Do those frequencies reflect anything significant, in your opinion, with regard to the results that you obtained from steering wheel item
Objection.
number 29?
Move to strike argumentative. Frequencies are the frequencies.
Motion to strike the question is not appropriate, California counsel.
My apologies. Objection.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Okay, do those frequencies reflect anything in relation to your opinion and your reservation about the results on item 29 from the steering wheel?
Rephrase the question.
What, if anything, do those frequencies reflect in light of your reservations about your test results from item 29?
Still objection.
Mr. Sims, you saw that chart.
Yes.
You indicated that you had some concern about the numbers that were there, the assumptions that were behind it.
Yes, my concern was just that with the assumption.
What assumption concerns you in
Well-
rendering that opinion?
What concerned me was that I, again, couldn't absolutely rule out the possibility of the 1.3 allele not being detected in that weak mixture. That's all.
Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May we see Defendant's Exhibit 1166 on the Elmo, Your Honor?
Yes. Fairlow? This is the dot blot photo.
Mr. Sims, you recognize that when you saw 1166, that's Dr. Blake's photo, is that right?
Yes, I believe that one was 1166, yes.
But the handwriting on there is your handwriting.
The writing on those strips is by Renee Montgomery.
Let's start at the top and describe the items so that the jury can appreciate all the results that are contained on Exhibit 1166. DNA 17, what LAPD item does that correspond with? And may we have the, it might be hard, the Bundy or the Bronco board up there? Mr. Sims, while we're getting to that, in spite of all the questions that Mr. Scheck asked you about Defense Exhibit 1166, do you have any doubt about the results that you expressed on direct examination?
No, I was confident of all the calls we made on this run.
In fact, focusing on Exhibit 1166 ignores all of the D1S80 results which were produced from analysis of these samples. Is that true?
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Mr. Scheck's discussion of Defense Exhibit 1166 does not take into account any of the D1S80 results on the items that were analyzed that are listed on 1166.
Objection to the phrasing of this question.
Sustain. It's leading.
What, if anything, do the D1S80 results contribute to your understanding and your expression of the results that are reflected on 1166, simply the DQ alpha strips?
Well, again, we looked to the consistency of the additional systems that were tested, and in this case, it would be D1S80.
Okay. While you're looking there, let's look at every alternate strip, if we would, starting from the second from the top. DNA 17C, that's a substrate control?
Yes, DNA 17C, it's cut off a little bit by the post-it, but that's the substrate control, yes.
And there's no typable activity in there, is that right?
That's correct. No
Is that-
dots light up at all.
And what does that mean?
that means that no activity, no DNA was detected in the substrate control for that particular sample.
Okay, and let's move down to DNA 18 control. That is the Bronco center console 31 substrate control.
Yes,
And that, again, would you describe those results?
yes, that control on DNA 18, which is 31 LAPD, again, totally negative, no dots light up at all.
And the DNA 29, which corresponds to LAPD 293, the Bronco carpet driver's side that was consistent with Nicole Brown, what is that substrate control? What result does that produce?
Again, the substrate control for that item was totally negative, no dots were seen.
And jumping another strip down to the lane or the labeled DNA 30 control, is that the substrate control for LAPD item 305 on the center console?
Yes, it is.
And that substrate control produced no typable results, is that true?
That's correct. No dots, not just no typable results, but no dots, period.
No dots whatsoever, and we'll discuss substrate controls in a while. But do these substrate control strip results show that there was or that there was no typable activity on all of those strips and all of those stains?
That's correct.
Okay, and let's start out with DNA 17. What was your result on that?
The type for that was 1.1, comma 1.2.
And DNA 18?
On DNA 18, that was a mixture of types, with the main type being a 1.1, 1.2, with the weaker type being the 1.3, comma 4. And what made this one more difficult was the assessment of whether or not the 1.2 allele was really there. I think we talked about this earlier, that there's not a distinct separate probe for the 1.2 allele. So you have a dot there, the 1.2, 1.3, 4 dot, that can be lit up by any of those three probes. And the key here that we, and admittedly, this one was one where we had to take a hard look at, was that intensity is so great in that 1.2, 1.3, 4 dot that the 4 and the 1.3 alone would not produce a dot of that intensity. So we made the determination from that we felt that the 1.2 allele was present, which meant that the main type was 1.1, 1.2, and that the weaker components were 1.3, comma 4.
And D1S80 results on that stain?
On DNA 18,
Yes.
we found both the 24 and the 25 alleles present.
And Mr. Goldman is a 24-24.
That's correct.
Mr. Simpson is a 24-25.
That's correct.
And that narrows down the possibilities when you include that.
Yes, it does significantly.
And let's move on then to DNA 29.
Okay, on DNA 29, excuse me. The call on DNA 29, and this is actually LAPD number 293. The call there was that this main type was a 1.1, comma 1.1, and it's hard to see on mine, but there was a little bit of activity at the 1.2, 1.3, 4 dot. So we interpreted that to be a 1.1, 1.1 with a possible trace of 1.2.
And there's none of this funny stuff with the 1.3 dot on this strip, is there?
On that strip?
Yes.
No, it was negative.
Let's move on to DNA 30 then.
Okay, for DNA 30, this is LAPD number 305. Now, in this particular case, this is where we talked about the tough call. If you contrast DNA 30 with DNA 18, you can now see that there is a 1.1 dot, there's a 1.3 dot, there's a 4 dot, but now the question is the 1.2 allele definitely present? And we argued, we discussed it, and we decided that no, you could not definitely say that the 1.2 allele was present because that 4 dot and the 1.3 dots could possibly give an intensity similar to that. So that's why on our chart we see over there possible 1.2.
Okay, Mr. Scheck asked you with regard to the results on Defense Exhibit 1166, or strike that. He asked with regard to one of the other sets of strips, could another trained eye disagree with you? Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Has any other trained eye disagreed with you?
As to these results,
Yes.
sustained.
Okay. Would you like to see another trained eye disagree with you on those results?
Overruled. Overruled.
I'd be happy to discuss any result we generated in this case with any other expert.
And has anyone had that kind of discussion with you?
Overruled. Yes or no? Have you discussed these results with any other experts other than Ms. Montgomery?
No. No, other than people in our laboratories I mentioned as part of the team.
And if some trained eye discussed it with you, could they also retest with the remaining evidence in this case?
He's calling for hearsay about trained eyes.
Overruled. Bob, the question was regarding retesting.
Yes, if somebody disagreed with these results, then they could retest the evidence, they could retest the extracted DNA, they could retest the product, the PCR product.
Mr. Scheck discussed in the context of this strip the possibility of PCR carryover. Do you recall that?
Yes,
PCR product carryover?
yes.
And do you see any signs of PCR product carryover in any of the substrate controls or any of the negative controls in this case?
No, I did not.
And I believe you said this is Dr. Blake's photo,
Yes, I believe
the
this one
the
is.
defense expert in this case.
Yes.
Were you present when he took the photo?
Yes, I believe he was because he was also present at the reading of that.
Were those
At the
two
time.
separate? I'm sorry.
He was present at the reading of these strips. We took our photo, and then I believe he took his photo, but I'd have to check my notes on
Could
that.
you do that?
I believe it was photoed on at that same time. Yes, I do believe it was.
At the same time?
Well, right after we made our photograph. That's my recollection.
Okay. And throughout this whole photography and reading process, have you consistently interpreted the strips the way you've described your conclusions to this jury?
Yes,
And also including the D1S80 results?
yes.
And nothing has happened to sway your opinion at all, is that correct?
No.
Let's move to Defense Exhibit 1168. Now, I believe you said, do you recognize the handwriting on this one?
Yes, I do.
That's Dr. Blake's handwriting?
Yes, that looks like Dr. Blake's handwriting at the top and on the right side.
What sorts of contact did you have with Dr. Blake with respect to the set of strips that were run that are reflected on Defense Exhibit 1168?
Can you rephrase that question for me,
Sure.
please?
What were the nature of your contacts with Dr. Blake? I'm not asking you to describe conversations. What kinds of context did you have with regard to the strips that are shown in Defense Exhibit 1168?
Well, Dr. Blake photographed these results in our laboratory. Again, I'd want to check because there were a couple times when he came back and photographed our photos, like there was some glare problems or something like that. So I think though on this particular one he was probably present. But if I could have 1 second, I'll check on that.
Sure.
Approach for a second about a matter.
No.
1054 matter.
No.
59, the Bundy board up there now, please.
No, it's not clear exactly when that photograph was taken by him.
Okay, was he present when you read those strips?
I don't believe he was. I didn't record that, so I don't think he was.
When you actually read them, are you writing them down, the results, on some sort of piece of paper?
Well, the way it's done is we have a run sheet where you fill out the results for each one of these dots, and the primary analyst, the one who does the actual run, writes down his or her results. And then what happens is the second reader comes along, looks at just the strips, and tells the primary analyst what his or her interpretations are. So we have two separate readings of these strips.
Okay, and at a later point, you show all those things to Dr. Blake?
Well, yes. In other words, Dr. Blake would review the strips.
And again, or strike that.
Strike. On review. The implication I want to
Overruled. No.
Now, Mr. Scheck spent quite a bit of time about whether or not the 1.3 was an artifact. Do you recall those series of questions?
Yes.
And you feel that it is that correct?
On that particular sample, I believe it is, yes.
Okay, and we'll talk about your re-hybridization in a couple of minutes, but do cell marks DQ alpha, polymarker, and RFLP results corroborate your opinion that the 1.3 allele that you detected, or the 1.3 artifact that you detected in that strip, is in fact an artifact?
Objection. Irrelevant.
Overruled.
Yes, they do corroborate that.
And would it be sound scientific practice to focus on the first of two hybridization strips to debate about whether or not the 1.3, which is seen on the strip on 1168, is an artifact when that issue is resolved by another laboratory's DQ alpha, polymarker, and RFLP results?
Objection.
Question's argumentative.
What impact or could you explain the impact that the cell marks DQ alpha, polymarker, and RFLP results have on the discussion you had with Mr. Scheck about the 1.3 artifact that might have been on the strip reflected by number 52 on Exhibit 1168?
Well, it doesn't, as far as the interpretation of that particular data, I repeated that result because of the overall pattern that I saw on these strips. But it doesn't, the final interpretation is consistent with that being an artifact.
And by that, cell marks DQ alpha results were what?
They were 1.1, 1.2.
Not a mixture.
That's my recollection.
Okay. And their polymarker results?
I believe they were also,
Objection to strike. He can't comment on polymarkers for me.
Sustained.
Assume hypothetically cell marks polymarker results included Mr. Simpson. Would that corroborate the fact that the 1.3 was an artifact?
yes.
And also, we can't forget your D1S80 results. Were they corroborative of the fact that that stain was consistent with Mr. Simpson and did not appear to be a mixture.
Yes, when we looked at an additional system, we saw no evidence that there was a weak component in a mixture.
Now, again, other trained eyes could disagree with you, couldn't they?
Yes,
Have any other trained eyes disagreed with you?
no,
Or
And nothing, has anything happened since you first interpreted the DQ alpha strip for your DNA item 55A, which is LAPD 52, which is on the projection screen as Defense Exhibit 1168, that causes you to question that that is a 1.1, 1.2?
no.
Okay. But nonetheless, you rehybridized it. Is that true?
Yes, in other words, within our own laboratory, we checked it out.
Okay, but before we move on to that, you've mentioned a couple of times that this was a tough call for you. Do you recall that?
Yes,
Now, would you explain what you mean, or what you meant by that to the jury?
Objection, testing this already on redirect.
I think we've asked it already.
Have you already answered that question?
I think we talked about it in the context of that other stain, which was really the tough call about whether or not the 1.1 and the 1.2 were together in that stain.
Okay. Well, can we put, may I have it marked as people's next in order? Mr. Sims, do you have the hybridization photo for the rehybridization of 52? Oh, before we move on, let's stay with 1168, if we can, for a couple of minutes. Start at the top, Mr. Sims, and tell us, there are a lot of things up there that have C's next to them. There's a 52C, a 47C, a 48C, a 50C. You see all those?
Yes, I do.
Those substrate controls?
Yes, all of those with the C at the end are substrate controls. From the top, it would be for LAPD number 52, LAPD number 47 substrate control, 48 substrate control, 50 substrate control. Those are all substrate controls for Bundy drops.
And just to summarize them, did they all produce no typing results?
Well, again, no dots at all were seen with those.
And what is the importance of those stains having produced no typing results, just in the context of this series of tests that are reflected on 1168?
Just within this series?
Yes.
Well, again, if you don't see any level of contamination, such as PCR product control, as you look across a series of strips like this.
Okay, and do they also have an important role in the bigger picture?
I think they have a very important role in the bigger picture.
And we'll talk about the bigger picture in a while, okay?
Okay.
Can we have did you give me your photo that shows the rehybridization of 52?
I believe that's back there.
You want to check up there, Mr. Sims? We seem to have
Yes, I'll
lost
check.
it.
I do have it. No, I'm sorry. This is not it. This is a different photo.
All right, have you shown that to Mr. Scheck?
And we have that marked as people's next in order, Your Honor.
274.
Mr. Sims, could you just start at the top of People's Exhibit 274 and describe the samples that are represented by those horizontal strips?
Yes, this is some rehybridizations of some of the samples that we wanted to take a second look at in this case. The first one is 42B1, which was stained B1 from the sock. The next one is 42B2, which is also from the sock. And then there's a positive control that was being rehybed, a negative control, and then the 50